coach. And so what we were going to move on to was the types of conflicts we see in organizations and teams. So Pattie, what do you tend to see when you go into an organization?
Well, before I go into that, there was one other thing I wanted to mention
Oh,
because this has a lot to do with the kinds of conflicts we see in teams, and this is about the attitude that we have about conflict. And so
mm,
there are four N's that I wanted to talk about conflict.
okay.
The first N is normal. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
conflict is going to occur in
Right.
organizations. So when I have managers and supervisors say conflict has no place in an organization, it raises a big
Sure.
red flag for me. So first of all, conflict is normal. It's going to occur. The second N is that it's neutral. And what I mean by that is that how we respond to conflict has everything to do with whether the result of that situation is going to be positive or negative. So a lot of it is on us on how we respond effectively or respectfully to conflict situations. The third N is that it's natural, and that goes back to that fight or flight response. We're hardwired to respond in a fight or flight way, but how do we learn other skills to respond to it in other more constructive ways? And finally, the fourth N is that it's necessary. In order for growth and change to occur, it's very important that we support and allow conflict to happen so that we can value differences, be curious about the things that teams have to deal with when they're meeting a goal or a task. So those are the four N's: normal, neutral, natural, and necessary. Now, the types of conflicts, this is based on a lot of research that's been done. And by the way, a lot of what I'm talking about today comes as a result of Craig Rundy and Tim Flanagan's second book, which is Becoming Conflict Competent Teams, or Building Conflict Competent Teams. And so this research says that there are three primary kinds of conflict in teams and organizations. One is relationship conflict. Now, relationship conflict is probably what you might commonly hear of. Oh, they have a personality conflict. Yeah. We're just gonna,
they're not good with people.
Yeah, that's just a personality. Let's separate them, And the relationship conflict really refers to the strong emotions, the intense emotions that can come out in a conflict. And when that happens, what we're seeing is a lot of finger pointing in teams. We're seeing the blaming. Well, it's all about leadership. They didn't, they're responsible, not us. Or the shoulding that goes on. And when I say shoulding, I mean shoulding, is that we're like, well, you should have, or they should have, or the leadership, there's a lot of shoulding going on. And I tell people, stop shoulding on others,
I love it.
Exactly. It's like, so when we're using that kind of language, when we're finger pointing, we're blaming, it brings that intense emotions. And so that almost always escalates a conflict situation. The second type of conflict we see in organizations and teams is task conflict. This is a much more constructive way of dealing with conflict when we look at a conflict from a task, or in other words, we're really focused on the issues, not the person. We're focused on finding solutions to the issues. And the team is tasked with creating a certain project or certain, process. There's going to be difference of opinions, and so in a task conflict, people are curious, they're honoring difference of opinions, they're sharing information, they're being open and honest in a way that allows that diversity to come about. And that's where that growth and change occurs if we're task oriented in how we deal with conflict. So we're taking the emotions away, and or at least we're controlling the emotions, not taking them away, but controlling them. We're going to de-escalate the conflict in this type of conflict. And then finally, the third type of conflict we see is process. We hear this all the time. You have team members who are like, let's get the task done. Let's get the job done. Let's do it right now. And then others are like, no, wait a minute, slow down. We have a process in place. You have those very process-oriented people. So how they work together and how they get the task done will often be a source of the conflict as
well. Okay, so we've got three kinds of conflict then: relationship conflict, and then what was the second one?
Task.
TASK. And
we're more cognitive about how we're approaching the conflict.
And the third one is process conflict. Interesting. I like the way that's categorized. So what do teams have to have then in order to process conflict effectively?
Well, in order to build conflict competent teams, and I also want to make a distinction too that, we talked about the three types of conflict, but that doesn't mean that is the source of the conflict. The source of the conflict could be a number of things from personality to preferences on how we communicate, how we think in a team, even styles of how we deal with conflict. We talked about conflict avoidance. We talked about very, very confrontational, cultural differences, values differences, even our interests and needs that aren't being met in a team can all be sources of conflict. So I wanted to make sure there was a distinction between the kinds of conflict and the sources of the conflict that occurs. Now, to have a team that's conflict competent means three crucial characteristics, according to Rundy and Flanagan in their book. The three are creating a right climate, and we'll talk about what creating a right climate means, supporting a collaborative environment, and using constructive communication. So those are the three things. Do we have the right climate? Do we have a collaborative working team? And are we using constructive communication in our team, especially during times of conflict? So let me just stop there and see if you have any questions about that.
Well, I would imagine that part of that climate business has to do with trust, because you were talking earlier about open and honest communication, and sometimes when we have to be honest, that's a vulnerability point, and so having that climate and that environment, I would imagine, would be important.
Extremely. You're right on for that. I mean, right on with that. The creating the right climate and the most two critical elements, I think, in the creating the right climate is people feeling safe. And I don't mean physical safety necessarily. I mean the feeling that I can say what I need to say without being retaliated against, that what I have to say has value, that what I have to say is I'm not going to be, talked down or dismissed in any way. That is so important. And of course, the trust element, as you just said, not only being able to trust others, but being trustworthy. So it's very important that those two elements are in place before you can truly have a collaborative element to the right climate.
So what else do you need then in terms of climate and environment?
Well, the other thing about creating the right climate is this whole emotional intelligence piece. So obviously the building blocks of a team are individuals. So if individuals, are triggered by each other and they start to go down the path of a relationship conflict, meaning instead of focusing on the problem that they're dealing with, the issue, now they're dealing with a personality conflict, they're focused in the wrong direction. So part of that is that emotional intelligence for them to have self-control, to be able to effectively communicate what's really bothering them. So one of the things when I'm working with teams that have issues around safety and trust is what are the behavioral norms that we have to create in the team. They create themselves for buy-in to say, in order for me to participate in this environment, this is what I need in place to feel safe and to be able to trust. And so there's a number of behavioral norms that they'll create. And then, of course, they have to model and demonstrate and abide by their own group norms, if you will, in order to build that safe and trusting environment. So that's one of the things that teams will need to do.
Now, how do you do that in the short form?
In the short form, essentially is, sometimes I have to have individual conversations because sometimes when I come into a group, they won't even have a conversation about what they need to have in place for a safe and trusting environment because they feel so unsafe that being able to say, well, I need that person to not dismiss me every time I say something because they already are putting themselves on the hot seat by just even saying that. So I could use techniques like meeting with them individually to get a sense of what they need. A lot of times what works is that they put what they feel they need on a Post-it note or index card. And so it's anonymous. And then I collect all of these and then I process and categorize them. Then I start to process it with a group in an anonymous way, and then there's a way of getting agreement about what are the things that are important to them. The trick is, once they're developed, how do we actually implement them? Because if people are not abiding by them, then there's an accountability issue around people not. And so then there's a whole accountability plan we spend time developing. So a lot of times I'll have a behavioral norm sheet that I work with them, and then they create their own accountability plan.
Pattie, can you tell us a couple of the organizations or types of groups that you either are currently or have worked with in the past? It can be some of your favorites or not so much.
Well, obviously, in the work that I do is very confidential, but I can talk about more of the large organizations. One of them,
or even general business industries and groups of organizations.
Right. I work with a lot of local, state, and government agencies. One of my biggest contracts I've been working with for about 4.5, almost 5 years, has been the Department of Homeland Security with the Transportation Security Administration, because they're actually changing their whole cultural environment. And so we deal with a lot of change and transition issues. And so, of course, those issues around trust and safety come up. But I've worked with a lot of universities, museums, small businesses, nonprofit groups. So it's a pretty broad spectrum, less corporate and more of the other types of sectors. But I have done some corporate work.
I appreciate you sharing that, because our show in general is about building a better, more positive, and more fun business leadership and community. And so having you on discussing the fact that there are so many different types of business industries, and if you actually consider balance, the whole work-life play balance, a lot of this conflict resolution can be brought into your home and your personal relationships and how you can deal with those. So hopefully that whole air doesn't come into, because some people are having conflict at home and they bring it into work. And unless they're digging deep in with someone like you, a consultant or a life or business coach, they usually don't even come to grips with that. And the manager doesn't even want to touch, or leader, manager, someone who's setting their goals doesn't even want to touch that personal life. Do you ever get involved or into in any of your individual group coaching where you bring in any type of personal conflict that might be causing some of the business and team conflict?
Well, when I'm doing conflict coaching, it's always one-on-one. And so I've had a number of people who've either contacted me through their workplace because they want to do conflict coaching as it relates to dealing with their manager. But a lot of times there's a conflict behavior pattern that also stems into their personal life. So, for example, I worked with one woman who was having some issues with her mother-in-law. And the issue she was having with her mother-in-law was creating her to avoid her mother-in-law, but she really wanted a different relationship. And so what we discovered is that she tended to have a conflict avoidant behavior pattern, both in the workplace and at home. And so we looked at what those patterns were and then really focused on coaching. How does she change that behavior, and how does she start to have more difficult but more enriching conversations with her mother-in-law and or this other individual at work, so that she can actually have those honest conversations but not feel so scary to her.
Must be a big load off of somebody too to figure that out and resolve at least that.
So how do we know, how does a company know, or how does an individual know when they need someone like you?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that when companies call me, they're calling me when they're in crisis. And that crisis usually means an employee is threatening a lawsuit. They're threatening something to the point that the supervisor, HR, labor relations are like, oh my gosh, we don't want to go into the legal arena. What do we do? And they're in crisis. What I'm always encouraging people is to contact me much, much early on. And so when they know they're getting into a situation that could really escalate and get out of control, before it gets to that point, they need to be reaching out to a facilitator. I do facilitation in teams, I do mediation, and I do conflict coaching. And of course I do training too. But it's that early on piece that can, if we get in before it creates a lot of long lasting damage, either relationship damage or damage to the company, to where it's getting out into the public, they need to be really cognizant much early on and contacting me much sooner.